When we think of Adolf Hitler, we often imagine the dictator at the height of his power, commanding armies, delivering fiery speeches, standing in full control of Nazi Germany. But power doesn't come without a price, and in Hitler's case, that price was betrayal and blood. In the summer of 1934, something unthinkable happened. In the span of just a few days, dozens of Hitler's closest allies, old friends, even the very men who helped him rise to power, were executed without warning. Today, we're talking about the Night of the Long Knives and Hitler's bloody betrayal. If stories like this make you question everything you thought you knew about history, make sure to subscribe, because trust me, there's a lot more they didn't teach us in school. So who was Adolf Hitler before the world trembled at the sound of his name? Before the salutes, the marches, and the camps? Before history carved his face into the stone wall of evil? Who was he really? To understand what came later, we have to go back to what came before. Adolf Hitler was not born a tyrant, he became one. After drifting through a difficult childhood in Austria and failing twice to get into art school, Hitler spent years in Vienna, living in poverty, sleeping in shelters, and selling hand-painted postcards on street corners. He wanted to be an artist, but Vienna didn't want him. And rejection can change a person. After moving to Munich in 1913, Hitler joined the German army during World War I. He served as a dispatch runner and was wounded twice. He wasn't a commander, he wasn't even a corporal with power, but he found something in war that he couldn't find in peace. Purpose. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler, like many others, felt betrayed. The humiliation of defeat, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and the collapse of the old world left him with one conclusion. Germany had been stabbed in the back, and he would make sure it never happened again. In 1919, while still working for the army, Hitler was assigned to infiltrate a small fringe group called the German Workers' Party. But something unexpected happened. He liked what he heard, and even more, they liked what he had to say. Within months, Hitler was the voice of the movement. That party soon changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or shortly, the Nazi Party. Its symbol was the swastika, its heartbeat was anger, and its future was written in blood. But Hitler didn't rise alone. He had help. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, also known as the Brown Shirts, started as a rough group of bodyguards and thugs. But there were much more than that. These men, many of them ex-soldiers, angry, disillusioned and jobless, found in the Nazi movement a new kind of war. Their job was to protect Nazi speakers, break up rival political meetings, and flood the streets with violence when words weren't enough. There were nothing more but fists in uniform. And at the head of the SA stood one man, Ernst Röhm. Röhm was Hitler's old friend, a fellow soldier from the First World War and one of the earliest believers in the Nazi cause. Unlike many around Hitler, Röhm didn't flatter him. He challenged him. He called him Addy, and he didn't fear him. He believed they were equals. More than that, Röhm believed he was the one truly shaping the revolution, and that the SA was the real engine of Nazi power. But power, especially when placed in the wrong hands, rarely stays quiet for long. And soon, the SA's influence would grow so large that it could no longer be ignored. By early 1934, the SA was no longer just a group of party loyalists. It had become something far more dangerous. What began as a private militia, formed to guard Nazi meetings and break up opponents' rallies, had swelled into a sprawling paramilitary army of over 3 million men. To put that into perspective, Germany's official army, the Reichswehr, was limited by the Treaty of Versailles to just 100,000 troops. That meant the SA outnumbered the legal military 30-1. And they didn't hide their strength. They marched in the streets, stormed taverns, and filled the cities with brown shirts, boots, and brutality. People had once laughed at them, drunkards, brawlers, street thugs, but now no one was laughing. The man behind this rise was still Ernst Röhm. He was so full of himself that he believed it was the future of Germany. For him, the Nazi revolution was not complete. Bringing Hitler to power was just the beginning, and he wanted more. He wanted what he considered real change, social revolution, military control, and an end to the old German elite, and he was prepared to fight for it. Röhm made his position clear. He didn't want to be on the sidelines while generals in polished boots gave orders. He wanted those generals gone. In private conversations, he openly criticized the Reichswehr and even called for its destruction. He believed the SA should become Germany's new military. The old officers were relics, he said, outdated, arrogant, and tied to the very establishment the Nazis claimed to oppose. This attitude terrified Germany's traditional power structure. The army's officers, most of them noble-born, trained in strict discipline and centuries of military tradition, saw Rome and the SA as uncivilized and uncontrollable. The SA were working class, fiercely loyal to Hitler and uninterested in preserving the privileges of the past. Many in the SA, especially young stormtroopers, viewed the army not just as rivals, but as enemies of the revolution. Some stormtroopers even began to talk openly about what would happen after President Hindenburg died. One SA leader warned that when the old field marshal passed away, the SA would march against the Reichswehr and seize full control. There were threats, and the army knew it. Hitler was caught in the middle. On one side was Röhm, an old friend, a loyal ally, and the man whose troops had helped him reach power. On the other side was the Reichswehr, small, proud, and deeply influential. Unlike the SA, the army still held real authority in German society. Hitler knew that if he wanted to fully cement his control, he needed the army on his side, and the army would never accept Röhm's vision. In January 1934, Röhm made his move. He sent a formal memorandum to General Werner von Blomberg, demanding that the SA replace the Reichswehr entirely as Germany's national military. The army, he said, could be absorbed into the SA as a training division. It was an outrageous proposal, and one that sent shockwaves through the military leadership. To calm tensions, Hitler called a meeting at the end of February. Röhm, Blomberg, and other SA and SS leaders gathered to discuss the future. Under Hitler's pressure, Röhm signed a declaration recognizing the army's supremacy, but the damage was already done. After Hitler left the room, Röhm reportedly turned to the others and scoffed. He said he would not take orders from that ridiculous corporal. It was a slap in the face, and Hitler heard about it. Still, he didn't act, at least not yet, but the seeds of betrayal had been planted. The SA's rise had reached a dangerous peak. Their numbers were massive, their leader was defiant, and their ambitions had become a direct threat to the only institution standing between Hitler and complete military control. Röhm's dream of merging the SA with the army was reckless, because in Hitler's Germany there was only room for one supreme power, and Röhm was about to find out what happens when ambition pushes too far. By the spring of 1934, pressure was coming from every direction. The SA had grown too large, too unruly, too ambitious. What once looked like a tool now looked like a threat. Stormtroopers patrolled the streets with their heads high, muscles tensed and tempers short. They drank, fought, harassed civilians, and the world was watching. Allies were embarrassed, enemies were whispering, and those in power, those who Hitler needed to keep close, were starting to lose patience. The demand was clear. Something had to be done. Even inside the Nazi Party, frustration with the SA was growing. Röhm's refusal to bend, to follow orders or show loyalty to Hitler alone became more and more alarming to Hitler's inner circle. Prussian Premier Hermann Göring was furious with the stormtroopers' behavior in his region. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, could see the public image of the party slipping under the weight of brown-shirt brutality. Rudolf Hess was irritated by Röhm's open contempt for party bureaucracy. Even Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, a branch that had once belonged to the SA, was watching, waiting, and calculating. The SS had begun to reshape itself into a force separate from the SA, quieter, sharper, and more loyal to Hitler himself. The SA's chaos wasn't just a problem of discipline. It had become a political time bomb. Röhm was demanding power that the army refused to share. As we already mentioned, in his vision the SA was the new army, and he wanted to be its general. But Germany already had a military, and that military wasn't amused. Men like General Werner von Blomberg, head of the Reichswehr, viewed Röhm as dangerous, arrogant, and unfit to lead. To him and many in the officer corps, the SA was nothing more than a street gang in uniform, and Röhm was the gang's warlord. Yet Röhm wouldn't back down. He lobbied Hitler for the position of Minister of Defense. He kept pushing for the SA to absorb the Reichswehr. He mocked the existing army's officers, calling them swine and too old to fight. And as all this tension built, another player entered the game. Former Chancellor General Kurt von Schleicher began whispering in political corners again. Alongside his associates, he floated plans for a new cabinet, one where he would return to power, where Röhm would command the military, and where old political enemies of Hitler might be brought back into the fold. These plans were clumsy and badly timed, but they made people nervous. Hitler heard about the rumoured plots. He didn't move yet, but he remembered. He always remembered. Meanwhile, Göring was playing his own game. On April 20th, 1934, he transferred the Prussian political police, the Gestapo, into Himmler's hands. It was a calculated move. Göring trusted Himmler to act where Hitler hesitated. Himmler, in turn, appointed Reinhard Heydrich to leave the Gestapo. Together they began quietly compiling lists: people who needed to disappear, enemies who were too noisy, allies who had become inconvenient. Some names were added for political reasons, others simply as bargaining chips. Kill mine, I'll let yours live. That was the trade. By late May, the names of those marked for death were circulating like secrets over drinks. Warnings were whispered. Former Chancellors Heinrich Brüning and Kurt von Schleicher were both tipped off. Brüning fled Germany, Schleicher did not because he thought it was a joke. But it wasn't. International pressure added more fuel to the fire. Hitler visited Venice in mid-June to meet Mussolini, who used the opportunity to scold him. The SA's violence, their wild behavior, and Rome's open homosexuality were ruining Germany's reputation abroad, Mussolini said. The criticism stung not because of the content. Hitler had never been shy about violence, but it came from another dictator. And Mussolini reminded Hitler that leaders who let chaos grow too large would one day be swallowed by it. Back home, the pressure boiled over. On June 17th, Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen delivered the now famous Marburg speech, a direct warning to Hitler about the threat of a second revolution. Coming from a conservative aristocrat closely tied to the president himself, the speech was more than an opinion, it was a shot across the bow. Von Papen even threatened to resign if Hitler didn't act, and while his resignation wouldn't have broken Hitler's regime, it would have made one thing painfully clear: control was slipping. Hitler travelled to meet President Hindenburg in Neudeck. The meeting was cold, but for once he didn't hide his frustration. He told Hitler flat out that if action wasn't taken against Rome and the SA immediately, the Reichswehr would declare martial law. That meant the army would take over, and Hitler might lose everything. That was the final warning. Hitler left Neudeck changed. For months he had hesitated. Rome had been a comrade, a fellow soldier, a man who had stood beside him during the Nazis' rise. But now the walls were closing in, and Rome's presence had become too dangerous. By late June, preparations were in place. Falsified evidence was circulating. Rome was accused of plotting a coup, of planning a takeover with French help, of drunken debauchery and treason. Lists of people to be killed were finalized. The army was put on alert, and on June 28th, Hitler called Rome's adjutant and ordered top SA leaders to meet him 2 days later at Bad Wiessee. Ernst Röhm believed he still had time. He believed the man he called Addy wouldn't turn on him. He was wrong, because in the world Adolf Hitler was building, there was only room for one power, and Rome had dared to forget who held the knife. In the early hours of June 30th, 1934, Adolf Hitler boarded a plane bound for Munich. It was still dark when he landed, and by the time the sun rose, the betrayal had already begun. This was the night when Hitler turned against the very men who had fought, bled, and marched to put him at the top. That night would be remembered as the Night of the Long Knives. It began with fury. Around 4:30 a.m., Hitler arrived at the Bavarian Interior Ministry. Inside waited a group of SA leaders who had just overseen a violent rampage through Munich the night before. These were comrades. But Hitler's face was cold and his voice was sharp. He ripped the epaulets from the uniform of August Schneidhuber, the Munich police chief and a high-ranking SA officer. He accused him of treachery, cowardice and betrayal. Schneidhuber was dragged out. Hours later, he was dead. From there, Hitler gathered his men, SS soldiers, loyal police, hand-picked executioners, and drove straight to the Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee. Inside, still sleeping, were Ernst Röhm and his closest followers. The men believed they were safe, the men who thought this meeting would decide the future. By 6 a.m., the SS burst into the hotel rooms. Röhm was pulled from bed. Beside him, SA leader Edmund Heinz was discovered with another man, a junior SA officer. Hitler ordered them shot on the spot. The propaganda machine would later use this moment, highlighting Röhm's homosexuality as justification for what was to come. But the truth is, the decision had already been made. The rest was theatre. As Röhm and other SA leaders were arrested, more executions began across the country. In Berlin, Goebbels made a quiet call to Goering. The code word was colibri. With that, the full machinery of murder roared into motion. The SS formed firing squads. Prisoners were pulled out of cells, handed death sentences and shot, some after mock trials lasting less than a minute. It didn't stop with the SA. Hitler used the chaos to silence old enemies. His Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen had dared to speak out just days earlier. Now his office was raided. His secretary, Herbert van Boos, was shot without warning. Other associates, like Edgar Jung, the author of the infamous Marburg speech, and Erich Klausener, a leader in Catholic Action, were executed without trial. Even Kurt von Schleicher, Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor, was not spared. He and his wife were gunned down in their home. Gregor Strasser, once a powerful figure within the Nazi Party, had already resigned in protest years before. It didn't matter. His name was on the list. He was killed too. One of the most haunting deaths was a case of mistaken identity. Willy Schmidt, a music critic with no ties to politics, was murdered because the Gestapo confused his name with someone else's. His body was dumped like garbage. These were not execution. These were purges. But Röhm, the man at the centre of it all, was not immediately killed. He was taken to Stadelheim prison, where he sat in a cell while Hitler considered his options. Some urged mercy, others demanded blood. On July the 1st, Theodor Eicke, commander of the Dachau concentration camp, entered Röhm's cell with SS officer Michael Lippert. They handed him a pistol and gave him 10 minutes to kill himself. Röhm refused. "If I am to be killed," he said, "let Adolf do it himself." When the guards returned, Röhm stood tall, chest bare, silent. They shot him point blank. By the time the blood dried, at least 85 people had been officially executed. The true number was much likely higher. When the sun rose on July the 1st, 1934, Germany was a different country. The bullets had stopped, the bodies were already being burned or hidden, and the night of the long knives was over. But what followed was something just as chilling. Silence and approval. The killings were no secret, and rather than recoil in horror, much of the country paused and then applauded. Hitler's regime scrambled to control the narrative. Goering ordered police stations to burn every document tied to the massacre. Goebbels tried to silence newspapers from printing the names of the dead, but then came a shift. The story changed not to deny the killings, but to justify them. On the 13th of July, 1934, Hitler addressed the Reichstag in a broadcast speech that stunned the nation. He didn't hide what had happened. He embraced it. He claimed that he alone had been forced to act to become the supreme judge of the German people because a treasonous coup was coming and only he dared to stop it. "I gave the order to shoot," Hitler declared, "and I further gave the order to cauterize down to the raw flesh." To make it legal, a law was signed retroactively declaring the purge an act of state self-defense. The courts, the Ministry of Justice, even the country's top legal minds fell in line. Scholars like Carl Schmitt declared that the Führer was the law. A telegram later revealed to be a forgery even claimed President Hindenburg had thanked Hitler for his swift action. Even families of the victims were paid pensions by the state, as if financial compensation could erase political murder. Some Germans doubted the official stories, others were horrified, but most stayed quiet. In Hitler, he stood taller than ever. In the blood-soaked silence that followed, he was no longer just a leader, he was absolute. So you're probably still wondering, why is the event remembered as the Night of the Long Knives? The name wasn't chosen by chance. It comes from an old German legend about a massacre carried out under the cover of darkness when betrayal struck without warning and allies were slaughtered by their own. In that ancient tale, the knives were long, but what they truly cut was trust. And in June 1934, Hitler made that legend a reality. Only this time, the knives were bullets, the darkness was political silence, and the victims were men who had once called him comrade.